Well, we start off by saying that I was at Oxford, right? We read law, and I met Evans-Pritchard. And he said, if you get a good enough degree in law, or whatever you're doing as an undergraduate, we'll take you on as on the diploma. Well, I got a good enough degree. It wasn't a very good one, but it was enough to get me onto the diploma. And so I took the diploma, which consisted of a series of lectures by the professors there, you know, and lecturers. But I got to know Evans-Pritchard quite a deal through just being there, you know. At the time, I think it was about then, I was writing my first book, Submariners. I wrote about the submarine service, you know. But I wrote it under a pseudonym because writing as a serviceman, or just as an ex-serviceman, I wasn't allowed to use my own name because it would cause difficulties here and there in the Admiralty and elsewhere. So I used the name James Casing, James for Jimmy, because I ended up as Jimmy, which is the number one of a submarine. And casing is the outer piece of a submarine, the external appearance, the external shape, the casing of the submarine, which is actually the tube, which goes down with the casing, of course, yes. But so I got to know Evans-Pritchard. I think he respected the fact that I had been in submarines, which was something, you know. Anyway, I got through to the Bachelor of Literature, B.Lit as they call it, after 2 years of anthropology in the Institute of Anthropology, of Social Anthropology, with Srinivas and Glackman, who were my main teachers, you know. Srinivas later went on to a professorship and a sort of senior position, very senior position in India, and Glackman went to be the chief professor in in Manchester. And and there was Fortes too, who went on to be the professor of anthropology in Cambridge University. So there were quite a crew to start off with. And then there was Nardell. I was told to meet Nardell when I finished my B.Lit, because he was going to start an anthropological department in Australia, at Canberra, the Australian National University. So I was the first student at the Australian National University. Oh, we had tea together, you know, Nardell and I, and he thought I was okay. And so I took up my PhD, was to be in the ANU. Well, that was interesting, going to Australia. I got married first to Rosabelle, the sister of a ne'er-do-well friend of mine in Blundell School, who retired from the army and went to Exeter College with me, and then joined the French Foreign Legion because he set his undergraduate bed on fire, and because the cigarette dropped off his fingers, you know. Well, and left the Foreign Legion with a black mark against his name because his father had to buy him out. And then he went to Australia, and I had married his sister by then when I went to Australia. And so he and his sister, you know, he decided to meet us in Canberra, and he never turned up, and he'd been up to more mischief, never mind about him. Anyway, at Canberra it was fun too. I enjoyed being at Oxford and being at Canberra as well. Canberra was new. And the point was that I had to go and do field work, but I needed a camera, a talking thing, a recorder, but I couldn't, they wouldn't supply me with the money to do that because it would be a precedent. And they would have to supply it to all succeeding students, which they did, as a matter of fact, but not me, the first one. Anyway, that was to New-Guinea. And I went to, by ship, of course, to New-Guinea. And then I went, how did I go? Overland. Yes, I flew into Bulgaria. From then on, it was Shank's pony, you know, had to walk here and walk. And I saw the administrative officer in Bulgaria and told him I thought Tango would be a good place to go. He said, yes, you just have to walk there. It's all right. So I walked into Tango, which was some miles from Bulgaria inland over a mountain range and plateau, and then another mountain thing in which was Tango. And I took up residence in in one of the administrative officers used to have a cabin anywhere in each village, which they used to use when they came up and around. So I went into his cabin, the administrative officer's cabin. Of course, he wasn't there. See, he was in Bulgaria. They used to come round every year or something like that. I had no trouble with them. A lot of anthropologists had troubles with. There was also a missionary at a church and centre in Catholic missionary in near Tangu, but not in Tangu itself, not the village I went to, which was Riyakitsia. And I settled into one of the cabins there, but I had no instruments with which to communicate, you know. But I had a little pigeon, which I started, but I didn't want to stay in pigeon, and so I learned the language, you know, as I went along, so to speak, and eventually got more sort of prolific in Tangu language than in pidgin. But I wish I could have recorded some of it, but I wasn't able to, which is silly on their part, you know, not to have recorded it. And even my camera, a silly thing like a camera, you know, somebody lent me a camera in in Australia, in Canberra. And so I did my field work there. I was only all by myself, you know. There was nobody to translate or anything. So anyway, I managed to fight my way through, so to speak, and went to the gardens with them in the mornings and back again in the evenings. But it was interesting walking along the mountain edge to the garden and trying to chat with the youngsters who, the elder people were, of course, gardening. You know, they were either planting or pulling up these roots, you know, not sago roots, anyway, like turnips. And or they were building their shacks, garden shacks there. And so but there was plenty of room to talk, you know, or try to get them to talk. And we did, in the end, talk in Tangu, in the language. All these villages that were called Tangu, Mangungiam Itzir and Riak Itzir and other Itzirs, they're all in Tangu, but they all had very different accents to the language. And my Tangu was Riak Itzir. Now, it wasn't spoken outside Riak Itzir itself, because anybody who knew the Tangu language from Mangigum or from Jumpitsir would say, what? Because it's like a Yorkshireman talking to a Devon man, you know. Neither can understand the other to start with. Then you begin to understand it's the same word, only it's differently pronounced. But anyway, so what can I tell you about fieldwork, except that you keep on asking people what, you know, who...
What was the topic you were interested in? What was the topic you were interested in when you were in Tangu?
Well, I wanted to know who the big men were. Well, that was easy, because they all differed, you know. You could see who was the big men. And nobody else had learned, you know. I was surprised because nobody else in that area, no other anthropologists had learned any languages. They'd done everything through pidgin. And so they didn't know the language at all, but I managed to talk to them, you know. And it was only towards the end that I managed to get these pictures, which my wife will show you, which they themselves tried to reproduce on pieces of paper, but which I had to reproduce in a sort of a form which would fit where they fitted it, that is to say, rectangular boards made from bark of trees, you see, and then they'd paint. And it's always in straight lines and a few curves, you see. If you have a corner like that, you put a curve to it inside. And that's how you build the painting up. I saw them do that, and so I copied them. And they were very fond of telling me stories, myths as we call them. And I got a lot of those, and they were the subject of another book that I wrote, because I gave all these myths. In Mambu, the first book, I only mentioned the myths sort of on the surface, but in the other book, I forget, what did I call it, love? Oh, anyway, it doesn't matter.
Encountering Aborigines?
When I wrote about their religion, I had the myth book. I had all these stories, which are myths, and I printed them out and translated them. And I analyzed them as to what they meant. So that gave me an insight into the spiritual, if you like, spiritual side of their lives, which really remained in the story world. It didn't sort of affect their lives directly. It was in the story world, you know, this is what the ancestors told us. The missionary had been there, or his forebears had been there for some time, and there were lots of Christians about, not in the village that I went to, actually, but around about. They'd all learned Pidgin English from the missionary. He taught them in Pidgin, and because it was a universal tongue in New Guinea in those days, and I think it still is, but it's probably rather more exact than it was. I used to go down to Bogia sort of 3 months or so, every 3 months, just to take a rest and to talk to the administrative officer down there. And he was interested to know what I had discovered, you know, and I told him how I was interested in these stories. He said, oh, well, you know, I'm not interested in their stories. I'm interested in what they're up to, you know. Because at that time, these things that they called cargo cults were rampant in various places. And these Tangu people that I saw were afraid that I was going to do something about them. They were definitely didn't like to talk about it very much. They always changed the subject if I talked about cargo, because they understood cargo to mean everything that Europeans did and all their stuff, you know. How was that done, you know? They thought it was done. Well, Tango didn't really. They said, well, you know, these people like Yadi, or Mambu, who was one of them, they say, you know, that the Europeans have all these things, why can't we? So they made them. They used to say prayers, or they built an aerodrome and said a prayer, and they hoped that an airplane would come down with all sorts of goodies. But of course, nothing like that happened. And they said, why are you keeping your secrets from us? They would say, you know. I say, no secrets. And they took, in those days, they took some New Guineans to Australia and showed them the factories where cars were built and lorries and so forth. And they said, yes, we can see that now. That's how you build them. But where did you get the idea from? You know, where did it? And you can't say you're going to the history, you know, our ancestors did this. Well, you can, because they could understand that if you said, our ancestors showed us how to make it, and we make it. And you can make it if you like, you know. If you come to Australia, we can't just build a factory here. We have to have all the ingredients, you know. We have to have this and that and the steel and so forth. And they would nod, you know, as though they could understand. And what they would say is, you have the magic words, you know. You have the words. That was really the thing. And they'd sort of tap their heads, you know, because you understand. And But they couldn't understand. How could they understand? They knew nothing about Europeans. And here are these people landing on the shores. What would we do if I don't know, green men landed here? What would we do? Except shoot them. And they speared us, to start with. But then they decided it wasn't any use spearing because we could kill them from a distance with a rifle and that sort of thing. So they surrendered, peacefully, because we didn't harm them. Did them no harm, but it did some good. And missionaries especially. Now all my colleagues hated missionaries, and they hated me for liking missionaries. And when I wrote my book In the Way, it's a double entendre. See, missionaries are in the way, take them away, and in the way of the cross, So that was the point of calling it In the Way, because it was a double entendre. And yes, but I didn't think of missionaries being in the way. I thought of them being as an aid to me, and they were an aid, because they had the experience that I hadn't had. They lived there, they'd spent their lives with the people there. They'd taught them, they'd asked them things about their own lives. They knew it all, and they weren't at all shy about telling me about what they thought about things, So I learned a lot from them of patience and so on, But I enjoyed the field work. I got a bit tired and homesick because my wife and by then my son were still in Canberra, and I didn't know what they were up to or doing, except I got letters, of course. I wrote back. But after a while you want to see your own folk. And so I just spent the year in New-Guinea, and then went back to Australia to write the thesis with under Nadel's supervision. Now, he hadn't a notion about New Guinea, because he'd spent his formative years in Africa, in the Sudan. So all he could talk about was the Sudan, and all I could talk about was New Guinea. And they're very different, very, very different, because they'd had experience in the Sudan of Muhammad, and Islam was just around the corner, and these people had only the Catholic missionaries there. People up there had other kinds of missionaries who taught them rather differently. So, they used to ask me about that. You Christians, this kind of Christian, that kind of Christian, which you... So they went after Yali, the cargo cult man, who said, do what I say, and you'll get the stuff. Say your prayers, and the stuff will arrive. Do this, and you'll suddenly one day find the airplanes landing full of cargo and handing it to you, like the whites do. We just get it, don't we? But you tell them, I paid for it. Where did you pay for it? I paid for it in Australia. I'm paying for it now, in the bank, bank. You have to explain a bit of the economic system that we use, and then they begin to say, they're not going to be found wanting. So they nod their heads and say, I understand. Kaput. Okay. So that was my first field work. And since it was my first, and I was the first in Canberra to take the degree, when I took my degree, I had a full oral. By that I mean that I not only had a table there, but all the staff were gathered around in the hall on tiers and tiers. So I was at the bottom of a large hall answering these questions, which were out of my thesis, you know. And, well, I got my degree, of course, but it was quite an experience to undergo an oral examination because, you know, afterwards my friends and colleagues would say, why didn't you say this, you know, or why didn't you say that? Because I said this, you know. Ah, yes, I know, but why, you could have done this and you could have done that. And they had all sorts of things like that, you know. So it was rather a trial, but I got through it. And then I was offered a post in the New Hebrides by the commissioner, the High Commissioner there, but I accepted. But then, only a few weeks later, after I'd finished my degree, he said he couldn't give me the post because he was being relieved, and he couldn't leave his post with an unfilled post. He had to go away, and he couldn't leave his relief with somebody that he'd appointed, like that. So, but then I went to Malaya. I found there was a vacancy as a research student in the University of Malaya, and I asked for that. They gave it to me. So I went to Malaya, Singapore. That's where it was. That's where we were headquartered. And Singapore is a different kind of city from any others. It was a world city. And it was full of different people, Chinese, Malays, everybody was there, Frenchmen, or, you know, so. And living in Singapore was quite a thing with a wife and a kid. And gradually Rosabelle, my wife, got fed up and said, when I said, well, we're going to this village in up country, you see, she said, I'm not coming with you. She wasn't at all interested in anthropology, she found, and seeing these people. So I had to go off. I saw the administrative officer up there, and he said, well, you better go to this village was called Minyak Beku, which is near the sea in the southern province of Malaya. And my introduction, well, I better say that in the next thing, because it's interesting, you know.